The last signature of the day always felt different. It wasn't the pen or the paper or even the number printed across the top of the contract, $61 million, clean and absolute, in black ink. It was the silence that followed, that brief, particular stillness when the weight of 18 years compressed itself into a single exhale, and the room felt for just a moment like it was holding its breath along with you. I set the pen down on the conference table and let everyone else do the celebrating. Handshakes, photographs, the kind of laughter that fills a room when relief and ambition finally meet each other. I smiled when I was supposed to smile. I said the right things. And when the last person filtered out and the door clicked shut behind them, I sat back down in my chair and looked at the framed photograph on the corner of my desk. My mother, taken sometime in the early 80s before everything. She's standing outside a small house in rural Tennessee, squinting slightly into the sun, one hand raised to shield her eyes. She looks like she's searching for something, just past the edge of the frame. She passed when I was 32. Ovarian cancer, caught so late that the doctors spoke in quiet tones and careful language from the very first appointment. The hospital was 40 minutes from where we lived, a small facility without the equipment, without the specialists, without the early detection systems that might have caught what was growing inside her before it had already decided the outcome. I drove that highway more times than I can count in the last 8 months of her life. And somewhere, on one of those drives, the idea that would become MedSignal Technologies first took shape in the back of my mind. That was 18 years ago. The company I built from a rented office on Nashville's Medical Mile, one of the country's most concentrated corridors of healthcare innovation, now served hundreds of rural hospitals across 12 states. Our AI diagnostic platform had helped flag early-stage conditions in patients who would otherwise have waited too long in places too far from the kind of care that city residents took for granted. We weren't perfect, but we were trying to be something my mother never had access to. The federal contract sitting in front of me, 200 rural hospitals, a nationwide rollout, $61 million, was the closest thing to a finish line that 18 years of work had ever produced. I looked at her photograph one more time. Then my phone buzzed against the desk. Unknown number, Murfreesboro area code, about an hour southeast of Nashville. I almost let it go. The afternoon was winding down, and I had nothing scheduled. But something made me pick up. Mr. Whitfield. The voice on the other end was measured, unhurried, the voice of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say and was still deciding how much of it to actually use. My name is Calvin Reeves. I run a small electronics repair shop down in Murfreesboro. I'm sorry to bother you, sir. I want to be straightforward with you. I'm not entirely sure this is the right call to make, but I figured reaching out was better than staying quiet. I sat forward. Mr. Reeves, go ahead. He explained it carefully and in order. He had purchased a lot of surplus equipment from a business liquidation sale the previous week, standard inventory for his shop, the kind of transaction he made half a dozen times a year. Old drives, cables, networking hardware. One of the devices in the lot turned out to be a wireless camera relay unit. Out of habit, he powered it on before wiping it. The thing was still connected. It pulled up a live feed, Mr. Whitfield, he said, his voice dropping slightly. Interior footage. I can see a room, looks like a home office, nice furniture, bookshelves along the wall. The feed is active right now as we speak. The October light was still moving slowly across my desk. Outside the window, the medical mile stretched out in the late afternoon gold, all glass and purpose. Mr. Reeves, I said, keeping my voice level. Don't touch the device. Don't close the software. I'll be there first thing tomorrow morning. There was a brief pause on his end. Mr. Whitfield, there's something else. Earlier today, before I called you, I saw a woman in the feed. She was in what looked like a home office, opening a safe. Another pause, shorter this time. I didn't mean to see it. I want you to know that. I didn't respond. The reason I'm telling you this, Calvin continued quietly, is because whoever that woman is, the person doing it, she sleeps next to you every night. The room was very still. The photograph of my mother sat at the edge of my desk, catching the last of the afternoon light. I thanked Calvin Reeves. I told him I'd see him in the morning. I set the phone face down on the desk and did not move for a long moment. Then I put on my jacket, gathered my things, and walked to the elevator. The drive home took 20 minutes. Our house sat in Green Hills, one of Nashville's quieter neighborhoods, old oaks, wide front porches, the kind of street where people still waved from their driveways. I pulled into the driveway as the last light was leaving the sky. Diane was standing at the front door when I came up the walk. My wife of 3 years, warm eyes, a light sweater, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She smiled when she saw me, the easy, unhurried smile I had come to know, as well as the sound of my own name. I walked up the porch steps and kissed her on the cheek the way I had done 100 times before. "How was your day?" she asked. I smiled back. "Good," I said, "really good." And I followed her inside. I left before Diane woke up, 5:30 in the morning, the sky still a deep, unbroken dark above the Green Hills neighborhood. I backed the car out of the driveway without turning on the headlights until I reached the street, an old habit I couldn't explain, and pointed south toward Interstate 24. Tennessee Highway, in the early hours, has a particular quality that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't driven it. The fog settles low across the fields on either side, thick and unhurried, softening the tree lines into something that looks almost painted. 18-wheelers move through it like slow ghosts, their running lights amber in the gray. The rest of the road belongs to nobody, just asphalt and the occasional overpass, and whatever thoughts you brought with you from the night before. I had plenty of those. I hadn't slept. Not really. I'd lain beside Diane in the dark, listening to her breathe, staring at the ceiling, and running the same sentence through my mind on a quiet, relentless loop. The person doing it sleeps next to you every night. At some point, around 3, I got up and sat in the kitchen with a glass of water and my phone, and I stayed there until it was time to go. Calvin Reeves, the man who had placed that call the evening before, ran his shop out of a narrow unit on a side street just off Murfreesboro's main commercial corridor. The sign above the door read, "Reeves Electronics Repair," in hand-painted letters that had weathered a few too many summers. A small placard in the window advertised screen replacements, data recovery, and general troubleshooting. The kind of place that had been there for 20 years and would probably outlast everything built around it. A bell above the door announced me when I pushed it open. The smell hit first solder and warm plastic and the particular dry air quality of a space where machines outnumber people. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Shelves lined both walls, stacked with labeled components, gutted devices and drives, organized with the quiet logic of a man who had learned long ago that the only way to manage other people's broken things was to keep your own in perfect order. Calvin was already standing when I walked in. He was a broad man in his late 40s, close-cropped hair starting to gray at the temples, wearing a collared work shirt with his shop's name above the breast pocket. He extended his hand when he saw me, and I shook it. "Mr. Whitfield, thank you for making the drive." "Thank you for the call," I said, and I meant it. He led me to a workbench at the back of the shop, where a laptop sat open beside the device. In question, a compact wireless relay unit, roughly the size of a paperback, its casing scuffed from years of use. He pulled a stool toward me and gestured for me to sit, then settled onto his own and began explaining, in the careful, plain language of someone who had anticipated needing to translate technical information for a non-technical audience. The relay unit, he told me, had been configured as part of a networked camera system, the kind used in professional settings where footage is stored locally, rather than sent to an external server. When he powered it on, the device automatically searched for and connected to its registered network. The software launched on its own, no prompts, no passwords required, and within 30 seconds, it had pulled up every active camera feed registered to that account. 2 feeds came up, Calvin said. One tagged to a commercial address, one tagged residential. He looked at me steadily. The residential one is in Green Hills. He turned the laptop toward me. This is from the commercial feed, recorded 6 days ago. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. A room I recognized immediately. The small auxiliary office at MedSignal's main building, the one used for storing hard copy, compliance documents, and signed agreements. The camera angle was low positioned, near the baseboard, behind a filing cabinet. Diane stood at the far wall. She opened the locked cabinet with a key she apparently carried without hesitation, removed a folder from the second drawer, and laid it flat on the desk. Then she took out her phone and began photographing each page. Methodical, unhurried. Her expression carried the focused calm of someone completing a routine task before a morning meeting. I watched the full clip without speaking. When it ended, I asked Calvin to pull up the second feed. He typed for a moment. Then he turned the screen toward me again. The image was sharper this time. Better camera, better placement. A bedroom. A nightstand lamp casting a soft cone of light across the near side of a king-sized bed. The feed was coming from somewhere near the ceiling on the far wall angled downward. Diane sat on the edge of the bed, her back partially to the camera, a phone pressed to her ear. She was still dressed, though the timestamp read well past 10 in the evening. Her posture was straight and deliberate, not the posture of someone making a casual call. I recognized the curtains. Dark navy floor length, with the small brass rings she had picked out herself at a shop in Germantown the previous spring. That was our bedroom. Calvin stood and walked quietly to a small counter along the side wall. I heard the sound of a coffee maker running. A few minutes later, he set 2 mugs on the workbench, one in front of his own stool, one near my arm. I looked at the mug, the steam rising off it, the ordinary comfort of it. I pushed it a few inches away. Not dramatically, just far enough. Calvin said nothing. He simply picked up his own cup and wrapped both hands around it, the way a man does when he understands something, without needing it explained. I looked back at the screen. Diane was still there, still on the call, still talking to someone I couldn't see or hear. 3 years of mornings and dinners and quiet evenings on the back porch, and I was looking at her through a camera she didn't know existed, watching her do something she had apparently been doing for longer than I wanted to calculate. Can you tell when the device was first activated? I asked. And who registered the account? I've been working on that, Calvin said. The registration is routed through a third-party proxy. It'll take some time to trace, but the activation timestamp, he paused. I can show you that now, if you want. Show me. He navigated to the system log, scrolled to the bottom of the list where the oldest entry sat. Then he stopped. He looked at the timestamp. Then he looked at me. There's one more file, he said. His voice was careful and quiet. It's from before you knew her. He didn't say anything else. He just looked at me and waited. Calvin double-clicked the file without a word. The timestamp in the corner of the screen read 4 years and 3 months ago. I did the math without meaning to. Diane and I had gotten married in the spring, which put this recording at roughly 3 months before she ever said yes to my proposal. 3 months before the dinner at the restaurant on Broadway, where I'd been so nervous I'd knocked my water glass over twice. The footage was different from the others. Higher resolution, wider angle. The kind of setup that suggested a dedicated recording rather than a hidden relay. The room on screen was a conference space, clean lines, floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over what I recognized as the Atlanta skyline, a city I'd visited enough times to know its silhouette. A long table, 2 chairs. A man stood at the window with his back to the camera, hands clasped behind him, studying the skyline, the way a person studies something they intend to own. He was tall, silver-haired, somewhere in his late 60s, the kind of physical presence that fills a room without effort, that makes other people unconsciously adjust their posture. He wore a dark suit with the ease of a man who had never owned anything else. I didn't know his name yet. I would learn it later. Franklin Mercer, the 70-year-old chairman of Mercer Health Systems, one of the largest private hospital networks in the American South. A man whose company had spent the better part of a decade lobbying against exactly the kind of federal rural healthcare initiative that MedSignal had just been contracted to lead. Diane sat at the near end of the table. She was younger in the footage, her hair shorter, her expression carrying a focused attentiveness I had come to associate with her best professional moments. She had a legal pad in front of her and a pen in her hand, but she wasn't writing anything. She was listening. Franklin turned from the window. "James Whitfield is idealistic," he said. His voice carried through the laptop's small speakers with only slight compression, clear enough that every word landed exactly as intended. He built his company around a personal loss. That kind of origin story doesn't stay in the past. It becomes the framework for every decision a person makes. He moved to the table, but didn't sit. Men like that don't become careless when they're lonely. They become trusting, completely, unconditionally trusting, when they believe someone genuinely shares what they're working toward. He paused. "That isn't a vulnerability we take advantage of," he said. "That's a door we walk through." Diane looked up from her legal pad. "How long will this take?" Franklin's expression didn't change. "As long as it needs to. Build the relationship. Establish credibility. Get close enough to the operation that access becomes natural." He said it the way someone might say, "File the paperwork," or "Book the conference room." Clean, functional, entirely without wait. We need his data infrastructure, the rural patient database he's been building for 8 years. Without it, our case to the Federal Contracting Board falls apart. Calvin minimized the video without being asked and opened a separate folder. Inside were document scans, printed, pages, photographed, and uploaded with care. He scrolled slowly, giving me time to read. It was a profile of me, 41 pages, organized by category. Professional history, known associates, speaking engagements, travel patterns, personal background. There were notes on the conferences I attended annually, the restaurants I preferred in 3 different cities, the fact that I arrived early to most meetings and stayed late after most events. There was a section on my first marriage, brief, factual, clinical, and a longer section on the decade I had spent afterward building MedSignal while living alone in a 2-bedroom house in East Nashville that I hadn't bothered to furnish properly until year 4. Whoever had compiled this had been thorough in a way that took time and resources and intention. Calvin paused on one page and turned the screen slightly toward me. A photograph taken from a distance, slightly blurred, the kind of image that comes from a long lens in a crowded room. A conference hall, rows of chairs, a stage at the front, name placards on the tables. I recognized it immediately. The Nashville Healthcare Innovation Summit, October 2020. I had attended alone, the way I attended most things that year. In the photograph, I was seated at a table near the center of the room. The chair directly to my right was empty. Calvin scrolled to the next image. Same conference. Later in the day. The chair to my right was no longer empty. I remembered that afternoon with a clarity that felt almost physical, the way certain memories do when you understand suddenly that they were never what you thought they were. A woman sitting down beside me during the afternoon session, with an apologetic smile and a coffee she nearly spilled on my sleeve. 40 minutes of conversation about rural healthcare access and the limits of existing diagnostic infrastructure. Sharp, curious, genuine. I had thought it was the best exchange I'd had at a conference in years. I had thought it was chance. Calvin kept scrolling. The last page was a single sheet, handwritten notes in the margin of my professional profile, added in a hand, different from the rest of the document. Smaller, more deliberate. 4 words at the bottom of the page. Make him believe you believe in what he's building. I read it once. I read it again. Then I sat with it for a moment, the photograph of the empty chair, the 41 pages, the 4 years of what I had understood to be my own life, and I placed my hand flat on the workbench. I stood up, reached for my jacket on the back of the stool. "Copy everything," I said. "Every file, every document, every timestamp. And don't tell anyone I was here." Calvin nodded once, without hesitation, without questions. I walked to the front of the shop and pushed through the door onto the street. Murfreesboro was waking up around me. A delivery truck idling at the corner, A woman walking a dog on the opposite sidewalk. The smell of coffee drifting from the diner, 2 doors down, mixing with the cool October air. Everything ordinary. Everything exactly as it should be on a Tuesday morning in a mid-sized Tennessee city where nothing unusual was happening. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at it all. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel the sharp, particular ache I might have expected. I didn't feel much of anything, which was, I understood even then, its own kind of answer. The absence of feeling when something should hurt is not peace. It's the moment before everything catches up with you. I walked to my car. The clock on the dashboard read 2:47 when I pulled into the driveway. I sat in the car for a moment after cutting the engine, looking at the house. Every window dark. The porch light on its timer, casting a pale cone over the front steps. From the outside, it looked exactly the way a home is supposed to look at that hour, settled, quiet, undisturbed. I went in through the side door, off the garage, and moved through the dark kitchen without turning on any lights. At the foot of the stairs, I stopped. From somewhere above came the soft, even rhythm of Diane's breathing, carried through the old house, the way sounds travel at night, when everything else has gone still. I stood there for a moment. Then I turned around and went back to the kitchen. I turned on only the small lamp above the stove, warm and dim, and just enough. I pulled out the chair at the far end of the island and sat down. On the counter to my left sat the espresso machine Diane had picked out the first month we were together. Brushed steel, built-in grinder steam wand. She used it every morning without fail. For 3 years, I had walked downstairs to find a cup already waiting, fixed exactly the way I liked it. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I looked away. In the cabinet above the refrigerator, the one we used for things that didn't have a better place, I found what I was looking for. A small wooden box, slightly dusty. Inside, a ceramic pour-over dripper, a stainless kettle, a bag of single-origin beans from an East Nashville roaster that had long since closed. I had bought the set years before I ever met Diane, back when the ritual had been one of the few things in my week that required my full, unhurried attention. I hadn't touched it since the wedding. I set the kettle on the stove, ground the beans by hand, poured the water in slow. The coffee came out darker than I usually made it. I carried the mug to the island and sat back down. 847,000. That was the number of patient records in MedSignal's rural database, anonymized profiles gathered over 8 years of deployments across 12 states. People who had enrolled because it was the best diagnostic option within a reasonable distance of where they lived. People who had trusted us because they had nowhere else to turn. People like my mother. She had grown up in a part of Tennessee where the nearest specialist was an hour's drive, where the local hospital ran perpetually behind on equipment and staff. When her symptoms started accumulating into something that couldn't be explained away, she went to the only place available. They did what they could. It wasn't enough. I had built MedSignal. Because of that highway, I drove 40 times in the last 8 months of her life. Because of the particular helplessness of watching someone you love receive less than they deserve, simply because of where they happened to live. 847,000 people in communities like hers were in our system. And someone had decided their private health information was worth more as a commodity than as a protection. I sat with that for a while. At 5 o'clock, I picked up my phone and called Eleanor Park, my personal attorney, a sharp and unhurried woman who ran her practice out of an office on Fifth Third Center and had a gift for finding the exact point where the law and common sense diverged. She answered on the second ring the way she always did, regardless of the hour. "I need to see you today," I said. "Not this afternoon, this morning." A brief pause. "I'll be in by 7. No follow-up questions." I set the phone down and finished the last of my coffee, dark, slightly bitter, entirely my own. The kitchen was lightening at the edges when I heard footsteps on the stairs. Diane appeared in the doorway in a light robe, her hair loose, blinking at the low light. "You're up early, sweetheart." I looked up and smiled. It came easier than I expected. "Couldn't sleep. Big week ahead." She crossed the kitchen pressed a kiss to the top of my head, and turned to the counter to begin her morning routine, pulling the espresso machine toward her, slightly tapping the portafilter against her palm the way she always did. I watched her work. In a few minutes, there would be 2 cups on this counter. The one I had made for myself in the dark, now empty, to my right, and the one she was making, set precisely where she always set it, exactly the way I liked it. 2 cups, the same kitchen, the same ordinary morning light coming through the same window. I looked at them both and thought about how 2 things could occupy the same space and have absolutely nothing in common with each other. Eleanor Park's office on the 14th floor of the Fifth Third Center looked out over downtown Nashville with the kind of unobstructed view that made the city feel orderly and manageable, all rooftops and church spires, and the slow bend of the Cumberland River in the middle distance. I had sat across from that view more times than I could count over the years, usually with something complicated in front of me and Eleanor across the desk, working through it with the methodical patience that made her the best attorney Dis had ever worked with. That morning, she was already at her desk when I arrived, a yellow legal pad in front of her and a cup of tea going cold at her elbow. She looked up when I came through the door, studied my face for exactly 1 second, the way she always did when she was calibrating how serious something was, and gestured to the chair across from her. I sat down. Without a word, she reached into the folder beside her legal pad and placed an envelope on the desk between us. Plain white, standard size, no return address, no postage mark. Her name and the office address printed in careful block letters, the kind of handwriting that gives nothing away about the person behind it. It came in yesterday's mail, Eleanor said. I almost set it aside, but I read it. Inside were 3 typed pages, single-spaced, no header, no signature. The language was precise and unhurried, the kind of writing that comes from someone who has been sitting with information for a long time and has finally decided to do something with it. The letter described in specific detail a legal strategy currently being developed by the outside counsel of Mercer Health Systems. According to whoever had written it, Mercer's attorneys were preparing to file a federal motion challenging MedSignal's data collection practices under a rarely invoked provision of healthcare privacy law, an argument thin enough on its merits that it would almost certainly fail eventually, but robust enough in its initial filing to trigger an automatic freeze on our federal contract pending review. The rollout we had spent 18 years working toward. Frozen. Potentially for months. Whoever wrote this knows things that aren't public, Eleanor said, leaning back in her chair. The specific provision they're planning to invoke. The name of the outside firm Mercer retained. The internal timeline. She paused. This isn't speculation. This is someone with access. Can you trace where it came from? She had already tried. The envelope had been mailed from a public mailbox, no useful prints, no identifying marks. But the letter itself had been typed and formatted on a computer, and Eleanor, with the help of a digital forensics contact she kept on retainer for exactly this kind of situation, had found a metadata thread embedded in the document file that pointed to a specific IP address. A public library, Harlan County, Kentucky. I looked at her. Harlan County sat in the southeastern corner of the state, deep in the Appalachian coalfields, one of the most medically underserved regions in the country. It was also, not coincidentally, one of the areas where MedSignal had run its earliest rural deployment trials nearly 2 decades ago. Call the hospitals, I said. Eleanor had already pulled up a list. 4 facilities serving the county and the surrounding communities, ranging from a regional medical center to a critical access hospital with fewer than 25 beds. I started with the smallest. The first call went to a general information line that rang without answer. The second reached a receptionist who transferred me to an administrator who wasn't in yet. The third connected me to a nursing station where a tired-sounding voice told me they weren't sure who I needed and asked me to hold. I held. The fourth transfer picked up after 2 rings. This is Dr. Patricia Okafor. The voice was measured and alert. A physician's voice, the kind trained by years of delivering information under pressure without letting the pressure show. Dr. Okafor, I would come to understand, was the chief of medicine at Harlan's smallest critical access hospital, a woman who had spent the better part of 2 decades treating patients in one of the country's most resource-limited clinical environments. I introduced myself and explained, as plainly as I could, that I believed she may have sent a letter to my attorney's office. There was a silence on the other end of the line. Not the silence of someone caught off guard, more like the silence of someone who has been waiting a long time for a particular door to open and is taking a moment to make sure it actually has. Mr. Whitfield, she said carefully, I've been waiting for someone to pick up that phone for quite a while now. A pause. I wrote a report about your system back in 2005. An evaluation when your team came through Harlan for the early trials. Another pause shorter. I don't know if you ever saw it. I said I wasn't certain. I told her I needed to find out. She said she still had a copy. We agreed I would come to her in person. She gave me the address without hesitation, the way someone gives directions to a place they never expected company, but always kept ready. After I ended the call, Eleanor set her phone down on the desk and looked at me steadily for a moment. Then, she reached back into the folder and placed a second sheet of paper on the desk beside the envelope. A single page. A list of names, 14 of them printed in 2 columns. No titles, no context, no explanation of any kind. This was also inside, she said. Folded separately, tucked behind the letter. I don't know what it means yet. She looked at the page, then back at me. But whoever sent that letter made sure we had it. I picked up the sheet and read through the names slowly. None of them were familiar to me. Some appeared to be individuals. Others read more like organizational designations. There was no pattern I could identify on a first pass, no obvious thread connecting one name to the next. But something about the list, the deliberateness of it, the way it had been folded and placed apart from the letter, as though its author understood it needed to be handled separately, settled into the back of my mind with the quiet certainty of something that mattered before I understood why. I set it back down on the desk. Keep both of these somewhere secure, I said. Not here. Eleanor nodded once, already reaching for the folder. We met at a coffee shop, 2 blocks from Vanderbilt University Medical Center, one of those narrow, unhurried places that exist in the shadow of large institutions, patronized mostly by residents, grabbing something between shifts, and researchers who needed somewhere quiet to think. Calvin had driven up from Murfreesboro that afternoon at my request, and he was already there when I arrived, seated at a corner table near the window with a plain drip coffee in front of him and his work jacket folded over the back of the chair. He stood when he saw me come through the door, the way he had stood in his shop 2 days ago, not out of ceremony, but out of the particular habit of a man who was raised to acknowledge when someone walked into a room. We shook hands. I sat down across from him. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Outside the window, the late afternoon light caught the upper floors of the medical center, turning the glass a deep amber. The street below was busy with the specific purposeful energy of a neighborhood built around healing white coats, rolling equipment carts, people moving with somewhere important to be. I want to explain something, Calvin said, about why I called. I told him he didn't owe me an explanation. I know, he said, but I want to give you one anyway. He had found the relay unit in a lot he purchased from a business liquidation in Smyrna, a medical equipment wholesaler that had closed after a decade of operation, its inventory auctioned off in pallets, standard acquisition for his shop. He had powered up the device, expecting to wipe it, run a diagnostic, and resell it within the week. When the live feed appeared on his screen, his first instinct had been to shut it down immediately and contact whoever's address came up in the registration data. That was simply what you did. That was the decent thing. But then he told me something I hadn't expected. It wasn't just decency, he said. He turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands, not drinking it, just turning it. When I saw the name on the relay unit's registration, MedSignal Technologies, I didn't have to look it up. He paused. I already knew what it was. I watched him. My father used to talk about your company, Calvin said. For years, long before most people had heard of it. He looked up from the cup. He worked for you, back at the beginning. I went still. Your father's name, I said carefully. What was it? Calvin held my gaze. Robert, he said. Robert Webb. I set my cup down on the table. Robert Webb. The name arrived with the particular weight of something long, stored, not forgotten, but set aside in the way that early things get set aside when the years accumulate and the company grows, and the faces, from the beginning, become part of the foundation rather than the present tense. I had hired Robert in the spring of 1998. MedSignal at that point was operating out of a rented suite in a building off Charlotte Avenue, 3 rooms, 6 employees, and a diagnostic prototype that worked about 70% of the time under ideal conditions. Robert had come in response to a posting I placed for a systems technician, and in the interview, he had asked questions that were sharper than anything I had prepared answers for. I hired him the same afternoon. He stayed for 5 years. In that time, he built more of MedSignal's early technical infrastructure than any single person besides me, wiring systems, troubleshooting, deployments, driving out to rural clinics in a company van loaded with equipment and coming back with pages of handwritten notes about what worked and what didn't. He believed in what we were doing before the results gave him any particular reason to. That kind of faith in the early years of something uncertain is not a small thing. He left the company in 2003 when his wife's health required him closer to home. We shook hands at a small going-away gathering in the office, and I told him he had built something that would last. I meant it. I learned through a mutual contact that he had passed the following year. Lung condition caught in the later stages at a small hospital, not far from where he had grown up. He was 51 years old. I had thought about him from time to time over the years. The way you think about people who helped you build something before you knew what it would become. He talked about the company the whole time he was there, Calvin said. And after too. He used to say it was going to change things for people like us. People who grew up far from the good hospitals. He looked out the window for a moment. He didn't mean it as a figure of speech. He meant it like a fact he already knew and was just waiting for the rest of the world to catch up to. I didn't say anything. He didn't make it long enough to see the rollout, Calvin continued. But he knew it was coming. A pause. When I saw that name on my screen, I thought about what he would have done, whether he would have made the call. Calvin looked at me directly. I didn't think about it for very long. The coffee shop had grown quieter around us. The afternoon rush had thinned, and the light through the window had shifted from amber to the softer gold that comes just before dusk. Calvin looked out at the medical center across the street, its upper floors still lit, its lower levels beginning to settle into the gray of early evening. He went the same way your mother did, didn't he? He said. It wasn't quite a question. I looked at him steadily. Then I nodded once. Neither of us spoke after that. We just sat with it, 2 men at a corner table near a window, watching the last of the afternoon light move across a building full of people doing what they could with what they had. Sometimes that is everything. Sometimes it is almost enough. I was still in my car in the parking structure off West End Avenue when my phone rang. Eleanor, 8 o'clock on the dot. James. Her voice had a quality I had only heard a few times in 12 years of working together, clipped, stripped of its usual measured pace. Get to my office. Now. I was already pulling out of the space before she finished the sentence. The building that housed Eleanor's firm was mostly dark. At that hour, the lobby, running on overnight, lighting the elevator, slower than usual, with no one else calling it. I rode up to the 14th floor alone and walked the length of the empty corridor to the corner suite, where the light under the door told me Eleanor had been there for a while. She opened it before I knocked. The office looked different at night, smaller somehow. The city, view through the tall windows, reduced to a scatter of lights against a black sky. The familiar landmarks dissolved into their own illumination. The conference table along the near wall had been cleared of its usual documents and covered instead with a spread of files. I didn't recognize manila folders, and printed spreadsheets, and what appeared to be a series of financial flowcharts rendered in a scale that suggested someone had been working on them for longer than just tonight. A woman I had not met before was standing at the far end of the table. She was in her early 40s, medium build, wearing a plain dark jacket over a collared shirt. She had the particular stillness of someone accustomed to reading rooms, before engaging them, watchful, without being obvious about it, present in a way that took up no unnecessary space. "Mr. Whitfield," Eleanor said, closing the door behind me. "This is Sandra Cho. She's a special agent with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit out of the Nashville field office." Agent Cho extended her hand, and I shook it. Her grip was brief and direct. "Thank you for coming in on short notice," she said. Her voice had the same economy as her posture, no words spent on things that didn't need saying. "Sit down, James," Eleanor said. "There's a lot to cover." They had found the thread through the list of names in the anonymous letter. The 14 names Eleanor had set aside. On my last visit, the ones neither of us could place at first. Reading turned out to be the connective tissue of something considerably larger than a civil lawsuit. Agent Cho had spent the better part of 2 days running them through federal databases, cross-referencing corporate filings and financial disclosures, tracing the movement of money through a chain of holding companies that had been structured with considerable sophistication to be difficult to follow. At the end of that chain sat Mercer Health Systems. "The lawsuit they're preparing to file," Agent Cho said, opening the first folder and spreading 3 pages across the table in front of me, "is not their objective. It's a mechanism." She tapped the top page. "What they actually want is access to MedSignal's patient database." I looked at the pages. Dense columns of figures, entity names, transaction records. "Walk me through it," I said. She did, methodically, without editorializing, the way someone presents facts when they want the facts to do the work. MedSignal's Rural Patient Database. The anonymized health profiles, gathered over 8 years of deployment trials across 12 states, represented something that did not exist anywhere else in the American healthcare landscape. 847,000 individuals from communities that had historically been excluded from large-scale medical data collection. Rural populations, underrepresented demographics, health patterns, specific to geographies that the major research institutions had never reached in any systematic way. To a pharmaceutical company developing drugs for conditions prevalent in those populations, the data was invaluable. To an insurance underwriter trying to model risk across rural markets, it was the missing variable in 2 decades of incomplete actuarial tables. To anyone positioned to acquire and license it, the conservative valuation ran to approximately $2.3 billion. "Mercer doesn't want to destroy MedSignal," Agent Cho said. "They want to own what it built." She explained the legal architecture. If Mercer's lawsuit proceeded and was granted even a preliminary injunction, their attorneys could invoke federal discovery provisions that would require MedSignal to provide access to its data infrastructure as part of the evidentiary process. Once inside the system, under the protection of a court order, the data could be copied, cataloged, and effectively transferred before any appeal had time to move through the courts. "By the time a judge ruled in your favor," Eleanor said, her voice quiet, "the information would already be somewhere else." The room was very still. Outside the windows, Nashville sat in its ordinary nighttime arrangement lights, on the world going about its business entirely unaware. I thought about 847,000 people who had sat in waiting rooms in places like Harlan County in eastern Kentucky and the high plains of West Texas, who had given their health information to a system they trusted because they had decided, for whatever private reason, that trusting it was worth the risk. I stood up. "They were never after the contract," I said. The room held its silence. They were after the people. Neither Eleanor nor Agent Cho said anything for a moment. The financial flowcharts spread across the conference table, caught the overhead light, and held it all, those careful columns of figures. All that architecture of concealment, laid flat and legible, under a ceiling light, in a lawyer's office on a Tuesday evening. Agent Cho looked at me steadily. We need Franklin Mercer to walk into your office and sign his name to a document that makes his intent unambiguous and admissible, she said. Our team can have the legal framework in place within 48 hours, but we need 72. A pause. Can you maintain your current situation for 72 more hours? I looked at her. I've been doing it for 11 days already, I said. Agent Cho held my gaze for a moment. Then she gave a single, small nod, the nod of someone who has just received the answer they needed and is already moving to the next calculation. Eleanor reached for her legal pad, and we got to work. It was past 11 when I pulled into the driveway. The house was lit from within the warm amber of the living room lamp, visible through the front window, the kitchen light on above the stove. From the outside, it looked the way it always looked when Diane was still awake, waiting without making a point of waiting. I sat in the car for a moment, with the engine off, looking at that light, and then I went inside. She was on the couch, with a book open across her knees, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, the way she wore them, when she wasn't quite ready to commit to them. She looked up when I came through the door. "Long night," she said. "Legal stuff." I dropped my keys on the entry table and loosened my collar. Eleanor being thorough. You know how she gets before anything significant moves? Diane nodded, already turning back to her page. "There's pasta on the stove if you're hungry." I told her I'd heat it up. I went to the kitchen. Standing at the stove with a pot in front of me, gave my hands something to do, which was what I needed. I stirred without thinking, watching the pasta turn in the pan, and listened to the small sounds of the house. The faint turn of a page from the other room, the refrigerator cycling on and off, the particular creak of the second floorboard from the top of the stairs that I had been meaning to fix for 2 years. Ordinary sounds, the kind that accumulate into the background noise of a shared life and become indistinguishable from silence. I brought my plate to the table, and we ate together, Diane setting her book aside, refilling her water glass, telling me about a call she'd had that afternoon with a nonprofit she'd been advising. I asked a follow-up question. She answered it. I asked another. The conversation moved the way it always moved in the evenings. Unhurried, low stakes, the verbal equivalent of exhaling after a long day. I watched her while she talked, not in the way she would have noticed, not with any change in my expression or the direction of my attention, but underneath the ordinary surface of the meal, I was cataloging things I had never cataloged before. The way she held her phone when it buzzed and glanced at the screen, before setting it face down without explanation. The way her eyes moved to the window above the kitchen sink at certain moments, not looking at anything in particular, just elsewhere. The way she laughed at something I said, and the laugh was real, genuinely real. And that was somehow the hardest part of all of it to sit with. I had spent 18 years building something on the belief that the most important thing a system could do was catch what other systems missed. I was only now understanding how poorly I had applied that principle to my own life. We went to bed at midnight. Diane was asleep within 20 minutes. I could tell by the shift in her breathing, the way her shoulders dropped the last fraction of tension they carried through the day. I lay beside her, in the dark, with my eyes open, looking at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around us. At 2 a.m, I got up. I moved through the bedroom without turning on any lights, lifted my phone from the nightstand, and went downstairs. The living room was dark and still, the furniture reduced to shapes and outlines. I stood in the middle of it for a moment, orienting myself, and then I went to the bookshelf along the east wall. The device I had picked up earlier that afternoon through a contact Agent Cho had arranged, no names, no paperwork, was smaller than a deck of cards. A wireless camera unit with a wide-angle lens and a signal range that would reach the router in the hallway without difficulty. I had tested it once already in the car before coming home. I found the book by feel, more than sight, a thick hardcover on the history of American medicine that Diane had given me for my birthday the previous year. She had written something in the front cover in her careful handwriting. I had read it several times. I did not let myself think about it now. I positioned the device behind the spine of the book, angled slightly downward toward the center of the room, and secured it in place. Then I took out my phone and opened the monitoring application, keeping the screen brightness low. The image came through clean, sharp enough to read the titles on the opposite shelf. The angle covered the couch, the coffee table, the chair by the window, where Diane sometimes took her afternoon calls. I checked the signal strength, confirmed the recording settings. Then I replaced the book exactly as it had been, same angle, same spacing, nothing disturbed. I went back to bed. The footage was waiting for me when I woke up. I watched it on my phone, in the bathroom, with the door closed, the shower running for cover, the screen turned low. The timestamp read 11:47, nearly an hour after we had gone to bed. Diane was on the couch, dressed, her posture straight, in a way that had nothing to do with being tired. She had her phone to her ear. The camera carried no audio. But I had spent enough years reading rooms and people across conference tables to understand, without a single word, that the woman on the screen was not the woman who had handed me a plate of pasta 4 hours earlier and asked about my day. Her expression was focused in the way that has nothing to do with warmth. Precise, deliberate. The face of someone delivering information to someone who needed it, delivered accurately. I couldn't hear what she said, but the shape of it was clear enough. I stopped the recording, set the phone face down on the bathroom counter, reached over and turned off the shower. The bathroom was quiet around me. Steam on the mirror, the faint drip of the faucet, the ordinary sounds of a morning, beginning in a house where everything looked exactly as it should. I looked at my reflection for a moment. Somewhere in the previous 11 days, without fully recognizing the moment it happened, I had crossed a line between reacting and deciding, between someone something was happening to and someone who had chosen, with full understanding of what it would cost, what came next. I picked up my phone, opened the monitoring app one more time, read the timestamp again. 11:47, we're still on schedule for Saturday. I turned off the screen. I could do this. The phone rang at 4:30 in the morning. I was already half awake, the kind of shallow, restless sleep that doesn't fully commit in either direction, and I had the phone in my hand before the second ring finished. Mr. Whitfield. Dr. Okafor's voice was controlled, but carrying something underneath it that her usual measured tone didn't fully conceal. I'm sorry to call at this hour. Mercer's legal team contacted the hospital administration this morning. They know I sent the letter. A brief pause. I need you to come in person. Today, if that's possible. I looked at the clock on the nightstand, then at the ceiling, then back at the clock. I'll leave within the hour, I said. I dressed in the dark, lifted my jacket from the chair by the door, and went downstairs without waking Diane. The drive from Nashville to Harlan County runs roughly 4 hours on a good morning, and at 5 o'clock, there was almost no one else on the road. I picked up Interstate 40 heading east and let the city fall away behind me. The skyline shrinking in the rearview mirror, the exit ramps thinning out the commercial sprawl, giving way to the kind of open Tennessee landscape that reminds you how much of the state exists between the places people talk about. Past Cookeville, the interstate handed off to a 2-lane highway that cut through the Cumberland Plateau with the quiet authority of a road that had been there long before the faster routes were built. The tree lines on either side had gone bare for the season, gray branches against a gray sky. The whole landscape stripped down to its structural elements, the way certain things look when there's nothing left to soften them. I had made a drive like this once before, November of 2005. MedSignal was 7 years old and running on the kind of operational faith that substitutes for cash flow when there isn't enough of either. I had loaded a laptop and a portable router and a prototype diagnostic interface into the back of my car and driven to every rural hospital within a half-day's reach that had agreed to let me run a demo. Most of the appointments had been arranged through cold calls. Most of the rooms I walked into were politely skeptical at best. I believed in what I was carrying. I believed it in the specific, slightly desperate way you believe in something when you have built it from a place of personal loss and have not yet accumulated enough evidence to know whether that belief is going to be enough. Harlan had been one of those stops. I remembered the drive down the highway, narrowing further as it entered Kentucky. The mountains rising on either side, the particular quality of the light in the valleys at that time of year. I remembered parking in a lot that needed repaving and walking into a building that smelled of industrial cleaner, an old carpet, and the low-grade exhaustion of a facility running on too little of everything. I had not thought about that visit in years. The road climbed now into the mountains proper, the two-lane winding through cuts in the rock face, where the hills had been opened just enough for the asphalt to pass through. Morning mist sat in the lower hollows, thick and unmoving, the kind that doesn't burn off until mid-morning. The occasional farmhouse appeared and disappeared around a bend, a mailbox at the end of a gravel drive, a dog watching from a porch. This was the country those 847,000 patient profiles came from. Not an abstraction, not a dataset. This, the mist, and the bare trees, and the houses set back from roads that didn't go anywhere else. This was what the numbers represented when you followed them back to their source. Harlan A.R.H. Hospital appeared after a long curve in the road, announced by a green highway sign, and then by the building itself, low and practical, the kind of architecture that made no claims beyond function. The parking lot was half full at this hour, the morning shift already underway. I pulled in and sat for a moment, smaller than I remembered. Or perhaps I had simply grown accustomed over the years to spaces that expanded with resources and intention, and had forgotten what it looked like to work with impermanent constraint. Dr. Okafor was waiting in the main corridor, just past the entrance, standing with her arms loosely crossed, wearing a white coat over scrubs that had seen the back end of a night shift. She was in her mid-40s, with close-cropped natural hair and the kind of eyes that had logged too many hours under fluorescent light and had developed in response a quality of attention that cut through surfaces without trying to. She straightened when she saw me push through the door. "Mr. Whitfield." She extended her hand, and I took it. "Thank you for making the drive." "Thank you for the letter," I said. I meant both words with equal weight. She held my gaze for a moment, assessing. I thought whether I understood what I was walking into. And then she turned and led me down the corridor. Her office was at this end of a side hallway, not much larger than a generous closet. A desk, 2 chairs, a shelf of binders, a window that looked out onto the parking lot and the hillside beyond it. She closed the door behind us and sat down. I took the chair across from her. Without preamble, she reached into the bottom drawer of her desk and withdrew a manila folder. The cardboard was soft at the corners, from age the label on the tab, written in ink that had faded to a pale brown. She set it on the desk between us. I leaned forward. The cover page was a standard institutional form, the kind used for internal reports and external submissions, alike, formatted with the particular plainness of documents that are meant to be filed rather than read. At the top, in typed letters, Med Signal System Evaluation Report, Harlan A.R.H. Hospital, March 2005. I turned to the last page. A signature line, a date, a name written in the careful, deliberate hand of someone who understood that what they were signing carried weight. I looked at it, and I stopped. Patricia Okafor, RN. I read it twice. The ink had faded slightly at the edges, the way signatures do when they've been pressed between pages for years. But the letters were clear and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who understood the weight of what they were putting their name to. I looked up slowly. Dr. Okafor was watching me from across the desk with an expression I couldn't immediately read. Not quite anticipation, not quite apprehension, something in between. The look of a person who has been carrying a thing for a long time and is finally in the room where it can be set down. "That was you," I said. It wasn't a question. She nodded once. That was me. March of 2005. I had driven into Harlan on a Tuesday morning with a laptop bag over one shoulder and the particular kind of optimism that lives just on the other side of exhaustion. The kind that doesn't feel like optimism anymore, just forward motion, because stopping is no longer a real option. The demo I ran that afternoon in the second-floor conference room of this same hospital. Was the 14th I had done that month. The setup was the same as all the others: projector laptop, a walkthrough of the diagnostic interface, a case study pulled from our early trial data. By that point, I could deliver the presentation in my sleep, which was fortunate because I had not been sleeping much. The response in the room was also familiar. The department heads were polite. The hospital administrator asked 2 questions about liability and 1 about cost, and then looked at his watch. The attending physicians sat with the particular closed posture of people who have seen technology solutions come and go and have developed, through accumulated experience, a reasonable skepticism about all of them. When the session ended, they thanked me and left. All but one. A young nurse had been sitting near the back of the room throughout the presentation. Not a department head, not a physician, not anyone whose sign-off I needed or whose endorsement would have registered anywhere in the hierarchy of people I was trying to convince. She had a notepad on her knee and had been writing in it steadily since the first slide. When the others filed out, she stayed. She asked me about the algorithm's approach to symptom clustering in patients with overlapping chronic conditions. She asked about the data pipeline between the diagnostic interface and the hospital's existing record system. She asked what happened to the output in a facility without a specialist on staff, not what the software recommended in that scenario, but what the workflow looked like for the clinician, receiving the flag in a real hospital on a real Tuesday afternoon when the nearest relevant specialist was 2 hours away. They were the best questions anyone had asked me in 14 presentations. We talked for 40 minutes. I showed her parts of the system I hadn't included in the formal demo because I hadn't expected anyone to ask. She took notes the entire time. I drove home thinking that the session had been, against all expectations, the most useful conversation of the month. 7 days later, a 14-page document arrived by mail at MedSignal's offices on Charlotte Avenue. A formal evaluation of the diagnostic system written in the structured language of clinical assessment, citing specific functions and their applicability to the Harlan facility's patient population, concluding with a recommendation for adoption and a detailed rationale for federal rural health funding consideration. It was one of the most rigorously argued documents I had received from any source, institutional or otherwise, at any point in MedSignal's history. I had used it with permission, secured through a brief phone call to the hospital's administrative office as supporting material in our federal grant application the following spring. The application that had come back approved. The funding that had kept the company operational through the 2 years that followed, when we were close enough to the edge that I had stopped letting myself calculate exactly how close. I had never learned who wrote the evaluation. The administrative contact I had spoken with was no longer at the hospital by the time I thought to follow up, and the document itself carried only an institutional header and a signature I couldn't make out clearly on the copy I had on file. I had thought about that document from time to time over the years, the way you think about the things that held something together when it was on the verge of coming apart, with a gratitude that has nowhere particular to go because you don't know who to direct it toward. I set the folder down on the desk. Outside the window, behind Dr. Okafor's chair, the hillside that rose above the hospital parking lot was bare and gray in the winter light. The same hills I had driven through that morning. The same hills visible from every window of this building, present in the background of every shift and every patient interaction and every difficult conversation that had taken place in this small, under-resourced, persistently operational facility. For longer than either of us had been here, something in my chest shifted, not dramatically, not the way it does in stories, with a sharp intake of breath or a sudden pressure, more like something that had been held carefully in place for a very long time, simply released, quietly, without announcement. I turned toward the window. I was not aware exactly of the moment it happened, only that at some point while I was looking at those hills, my vision blurred, and I let it. I didn't say anything. I didn't try to account for it or redirect it. I just sat with the particular weight of understanding that the thing I had built in the years when I was most certain I was building it alone had been held up at a critical moment by a person whose name I had never known. That is not a small thing to learn about your own life. Dr. Okafor didn't speak. She didn't fill the silence with reassurance or professional distance. She simply reached across the corner of the desk and placed her hand lightly on my shoulder. A brief, human gesture, the kind that doesn't ask anything of the person receiving it. After a moment, she said quietly, 847,000 people are counting on you right now, and not one of them knows your name. I took a slow breath, reached up and cleared my face with the back of my hand, turned back toward the desk. Dr. Okafor was watching me with the steady, unhurried attention of someone who has spent decades in rooms where difficult things happen and has learned that the most useful thing you can offer most of the time is simply to remain present. Tell me everything you know about Mercer, I said. She reached for the folder. By the time I got back to Nashville, the afternoon had gone, and the city was well into its evening. I called Eleanor from the highway and gave her the short version, enough to explain why I needed everyone in the same room before midnight. She made 3 calls while I was still driving. When I walked through the door of her office 2 hours later, the other chairs were already filled. Calvin had driven up from Murfreesboro for the second time in a week, still in his work clothes, a cup of gas station coffee on the table in front of him. Agent Cho sat at the corner of the conference table with a slim, government-issued laptop open beside her, and the particular quality of stillness she carried into every room present, calibrated giving nothing away until she was ready to. Eleanor stood at the window for a moment after I came in, then took her seat at the head of the table. 36 hours. That was what we had. Eleanor opened without preamble. The legal architecture she laid out had been in construction for the better part of 3 days, built around a structural feature of MedSignal's corporate framework that had existed quietly and without consequence since the company's early years. She walked us through it methodically, using the kind of plain language she reserved for moments when precision mattered more than impression. The document Franklin Mercer would be asked to sign on Saturday was a technology access and litigation rights agreement on its face, a straightforward instrument granting his organization preferential access to MedSignal's platform in exchange for withdrawing the pending legal challenge. Exactly the kind of arrangement his team would expect James to offer, from a position of weakness. Exactly the kind of agreement they would be prepared to accept. Scheduled subsection 4 was 9 lines of text buried in the agreement's 3rd appendix. Eleanor had drafted it herself in language drawn from established corporate law, precise enough to withstand scrutiny and dense enough to require careful reading under unhurried conditions to fully parse. What it establishes, Eleanor said, is that any party executing this agreement accepts co-custodianship of MedSignal's patient data infrastructure, including all associated regulatory obligations, compliance costs, and federal reporting requirements, effective upon signature. She looked around the table. The moment Franklin Mercer signs, he doesn't acquire the data. He acquires the responsibility for it. Every HIPAA obligation, every federal audit exposure, every liability that comes with holding the health information of nearly 1 million rural patients. She paused. His attorneys will review the main agreement thoroughly. They will look at the payment structure, the access provisions, the withdrawal terms. They will not spend adequate time on the appendices. Not under a 72-hour window with a client who has already decided he's won. Agent Cho leaned forward slightly. Every recording device in the building Saturday operates under Title III federal authorization, she said. That authorization was secured 48 hours ago and covers all audio and video capture within the designated space. Everything Franklin Mercer says in that room, every signature he places on that document is fully admissible. A brief pause. There is no legal mechanism by which his team can challenge the evidence after the fact. The authorizations predates the operation. The record is clean. She looked at Calvin. Calvin straightened in his chair. He had been quiet through most of the presentation, listening with the focused attention of someone who understood that the room was operating in a register slightly above his usual professional terrain, and had decided the appropriate response was to pay close attention rather than fill the space. The drive and all associated files were transferred to the FBI's Digital Evidence Unit 4 days ago, he said. Chain of custody documentation has been completed. Everything has been verified and logged. He looked at me directly. It's all in the right hands. I looked at each of them in turn. Eleanor, who had spent 3 days building something nearly invisible inside a legal document. Agent Cho, who had been running a parallel operation for longer than I had known this was happening. Calvin, who had made a phone call 11 days ago because his father had taught him that staying quiet about the wrong things was its own kind of failure. Eleanor slid a single page across the table toward me. A signature authorization, formal consent for MedSignal's legal representative to proceed with the structured agreement on Saturday with full knowledge of its terms and intended operation. I picked up the pen, signed where indicated, set it back down. Eleanor took the page and placed it in the folder without ceremony. The meeting ended at 1:30 in the morning. Agent Cho packed her laptop and left with the quiet efficiency she brought to every transition. Eleanor walked her out and came back to gather her own files, exchanging a few words with me in the low voice people use in offices after midnight when the building around them has gone completely still. Calvin was last. He put on his jacket, picked up the empty coffee cup from the table, and dropped it in the bin by the door. Then he turned and extended his hand. I shook it. He held on a beat longer than the grip required. Not dramatically, just the way a man holds on when the handshake is doing more than a handshake usually does. My father would have wanted to see Saturday, he said. I kept my hand in his. He will, I said, in his own way. Calvin nodded, once the small, complete nod of someone who has received exactly what he came for, and walked out. I stayed after everyone had gone. The conference table held the ghost of the meeting, a few pen marks on a notepad, a water ring from someone's glass, the slight displacement of chairs that meant people had actually been here working until the small hours of a Thursday morning. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and took out my wallet. Behind the cards and the folded receipts that accumulate, without intention, there was a photograph small wallet-sized, the kind printed at a drugstore and trimmed by hand. The corners had gone soft from years of contact with the leather. The image itself was faded slightly at the edges. My mother, the same photograph I kept on my desk, reduced to something I could carry. I set it on the table in front of me and looked at it in the low light of Eleanor's office. Almost, I said. The word sat in the empty room. Almost. Friday morning came quietly, the light through the office windows, steady and unhurried. I had been at my desk since 6, the agreement open in front of me for the 4th time, not searching for anything new, just running the sequence one final time, the way you do when discipline matters more than doubt. Schedule C, subsection 4, 3rd appendix, 9 lines, exactly where it needed to be. I set the document down. 3 knocks at the door. Slow, a full pause. Between each one, not Diane's usual quick double rap. Something measured and deliberate, the knock of a hand that had been raised and lowered more than once before finally making contact. Come in, I said. She entered without coffee, without her phone, without anything. Closed the door behind her, sat in the chair across from my desk, and folded her hands in her lap. I need to tell you something, she said. Before tomorrow, I leaned back, said nothing. She started at the beginning. The assignment had been structured before they ever met. A profile, a timeline, a conference in Nashville every October, where the seat beside him was reliably empty by the afternoon session. She had been given instructions and she had followed them. The first year moved according to plan. Then she stopped, started again. The second year, you weren't what the document described. She looked at her hands, then back up. The profile said you were driven by ego, that you'd respond to someone who reflected that ambition back at you. A pause. But you listened to people who had nothing to offer you. You remembered names, patients, and case studies, clinicians who called with complaints more than data. You stayed late because you actually believed in what you were doing. The room held its stillness. I found myself looking for reasons to be in the same room, she said. That wasn't part of the plan. 3 months ago, before any of this had surfaced, before a relay unit appeared in a repair shop in Murfreesboro. She had contacted the FBI's Nashville field office on her own, not because of what was being done to me, because of what she had found being done to others. Working inside MedSignal, she had come across outcome data from 12 Mercer Health facilities, figures that had been adjusted to reduce their reported rate of patients who hadn't made it under their care. The actual numbers before adjustment pointed to treatment failures that had been systematically concealed to protect insurance contracts. The gap between what happened and what was documented represented across those 12 facilities a significant number of people who had deserved better. They weren't abstractions, she said, her voice stripped down to something unguarded. They were people, with names and families. I couldn't keep going after I found that out. She looked at me steadily. I'm not telling you this so you'll think better of what I did. I'm telling you because you deserve to know that the moment I understood the full scope of what I was part of, I made a different choice. I stood and walked to the window. The Green Hills street outside was going about its Friday morning, a neighbor walking a dog, a delivery van, pulling away from the curb. Ordinary, entirely unaware. Did you love any of it? I asked. Quieter than I expected. Any part of the 3 years. The silence that followed was long enough to be its own answer. That's the part I can't give you a clean answer to, she said. And I know that's not fair. I crossed to the office door and opened it. Franklin gets here tomorrow at 9, I said, my voice back in its ordinary register. I need you to be there. She stood, looked at me for a moment. I know, she said. She walked past me into the hallway. I pulled the door closed. The agreement was still on the desk. I picked it up, read the final paragraph one last time, not because I needed to, but because some things deserve a final acknowledgement before they're set in motion. Then, I folded it along Eleanor's crease, slid it into the folder, and placed it on the corner of the desk. I looked at my hands, still, completely still. 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning in December, and I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, buttoning a vest I hadn't worn in almost 2 years. Navy blue, the same shade I had put on the morning in 2006 when I drove to a borrowed conference room in a building on Charlotte Avenue and signed the first contract in MedSignal's history across a folding table with a pen I had to ask to borrow. Not superstition, just the particular logic of a person who understands that some days require you to show up as the most deliberate version of yourself, and that certain objects help locate that version when the distance between who you are and who you need to be feels wider than usual. I looked at myself in the mirror, 57 years old. The hair at my temples had gone further silver than I remembered from the last time I had looked this carefully, which was probably the point you stop examining certain things, when life is moving fast enough that the accumulation doesn't register until you pause. In 2006, standing in front of a different mirror in a much smaller apartment, I had noticed my hand trembling slightly as I knotted my tie. Not from fear exactly, from the specific physical weight of understanding that the signature I was about to place would redirect the next chapter of my life in ways I could not fully see yet. That kind of trembling is not weakness. It's the body registering the significance of what the mind is about to do. This morning, my hands were steady. Not the careful steadiness of someone suppressing something, but the deeper stillness of a person who has moved through the full distance of a thing and arrived finally at its far edge. 18 years of building, 12 days of navigating what had been built against me, and one morning now to see it through. I picked up my jacket from the chair, went downstairs. Diane was in the kitchen when I passed through, dressed, composed, holding a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking. We looked at each other briefly. Neither of us said anything. There was nothing that needed saying that hadn't already been said, and several things that could never be said adequately, regardless of the words available. I took my keys from the hook by the side door and drove to the office. Eleanor was already at her desk when I arrived at 7:30, a legal pad in front of her, and the kind of focused quiet around her that meant she had been there for a while. She looked up when I came in, assessed me in the way she always did, and gave a single nod that communicated everything a longer exchange would have. The building had a different quality that morning. Harder to name than simply quiet, more like the particular stillness of a space that knows something is about to happen in it and is holding itself accordingly. Agent Cho and her team were positioned on the floor below, in a configuration I had been walked through the previous evening. Recording equipment authorized under federal statute, activated and confirmed. Every device in the building's main conference room fully operational. I walked to the window of my office and looked down at the parking structure across the street. Calvin's truck was in the far corner of the lot, a dark blue pickup I recognized from the day he had driven up to Nashville to meet me near Vanderbilt. He was behind the wheel, engine off. I had asked him to be there and to stay there, not inside, not in the building, just present in the way that certain people need to be present for certain things, even when their role is only to witness from a distance. I watched the trucks for a moment. Then I turned back to the room. At 9 o'clock exactly, a black sedan pulled through the entrance of the Medical Mile complex and came to a stop at the building's main entrance. 3 doors opened. Franklin Mercer stepped out first. In person, he carried the same quality I had observed in the footage from years ago, that unhurried authority, the physical ease of a man who had spent decades ensuring that every room he entered understood before he spoke a word that he had arrived. He wore a dark overcoat over a charcoal suit, and he moved across the sidewalk toward the entrance with the particular confidence of someone who considers the outcome of a thing settled before the thing has technically begun. Behind him came his attorney, a compact man in his early 50s, carrying a slim, leather portfolio. The kind of lawyer who communicated competence through economy of motion rather than presence. And a third figure, a notary, a professional whose role was to make everything that happened in the next hour formally, legally, irrevocably recorded. Diane met them at the elevator. I heard her voice in the corridor, warm, practiced, offering coffee, commenting on the drive from Charlotte. Her professional register, the one I had watched her calibrate to rooms and people for 3 years. When she brought them through to the conference room, I was standing near the window. Franklin crossed to me directly, extended his hand with the generous warmth of a man who could afford to be gracious, because he believed the terms were already his. Raymond. His grip was firm, measured. He looked around the room with the slow satisfaction of someone taking inventory. Beautiful office. You've built something remarkable here. I met his eyes. I know, I said. He settled into the chair across the table, unbuttoned his coat, and opened the portfolio in front of him. His attorney took the seat to his left and reached for the agreement without being asked, beginning to turn pages with the brisk efficiency of someone who had reviewed the document already and was now performing the formality of review for the record. The notary set up a small camera on a compact tripod at the corner of the table, angled toward the signature area. Standard procedure. Everything above board. Everything documented. Outside the conference room windows, the Nashville Medical Mile stretched out in the clear December light, all glass and purpose, the kind of morning that makes a city look exactly like what it wants to be. I pulled out my chair and sat down. I placed my hands on the table in front of me. Steady. Entirely, genuinely steady. Not the discipline of a man holding something in check, but the settled calm of one who has already made every decision that mattered and is simply now present for what comes next. For the first time in 12 days, the stillness felt like something I had actually arrived at, rather than something I was working to maintain. Franklin's attorney turned another page. The morning light held. Franklin's attorney worked through the agreement the way experienced legal counsel works through any document their client has already decided to sign, with the appearance of thoroughness, rather than its substance, attention, moving at the pace of confirmation, rather than scrutiny. He read, standing up, one hand resting on the table, turning pages at intervals that suggested he was covering ground rather than covering it carefully. He paused at the payment structure in the second section, at a representation clause in the fourth, and at a definitions provision near the middle that generated the only question he directed at Eleanor directly. Eleanor answered each one from her seat, without consulting notes, in the level and unhurried tone of someone who had drafted the document herself and could recite any passage from memory if asked, which she had and could. 11 minutes elapsed between the attorney picking up the agreement and setting it back down. James had been watching the room. Not obviously, nothing in his posture or expression suggested anything other than the polite, slightly distracted attention of a man sitting through a process he had agreed to and was now waiting out. He had his hands loosely clasped on the table in front of him. He looked at the attorney when the attorney spoke. He looked at Eleanor when Eleanor responded. He looked at Franklin occasionally, the way you look at someone across a table when the conversation requires it. What he was actually doing was counting. Pages turned, sections covered, the appendices approaching. When the attorney reached the payment schedule in Section 7, James leaned forward slightly. Sorry, can I just clarify something here? He looked at the page the attorney was holding, then back at Franklin, with the expression of a man catching himself on a detail. I was reading this as the second disbursement, triggering on execution rather than on delivery. But that's... He paused, scanned the line, again made a small sound of self-correction. No, I'm reading it wrong. Delivery. Right. A brief, self-deprecating smile. Long week. Franklin's expression shifted into something that was almost paternal. Patient. The particular quality of patience that comes from a position of control, the tolerance of someone who can afford to wait because the outcome is already settled. The disbursement structure is straightforward, he said, in the measured tone of a man explaining something to someone who is struggling slightly to keep up. You'll find it's actually more favorable than your original proposal. We simplified the trigger language on purpose. Of course, James said. Thank you. He settled back. The attorney closed the agreement. He looked at Franklin and gave a single nod, brief, professional. The nod that means we're clear. Franklin uncapped his pen. He signed in 3 places. The first signature clean and practiced, the second identical. The third placed with the slight additional pressure of a man who understood that the third signature on a document is the one that makes the other 2 permanent. The notary moved with quiet efficiency, verification of identification, the mechanical press of the seal into each page, the activation of the small document camera at the corner of the table. Every step logged, every signature witnessed and recorded under the full authority of the process Franklin's own team had insisted on. Eleanor countersigned as legal witness. The pen went down. 12 minutes start to finish. Franklin set his hands flat on the table with the satisfied ease of someone who had just completed a transaction they had been working toward for a long time. He looked across at James with the expression of a man who was already thinking about the next step. James stood up, not abruptly, not dramatically, just stood the way a person stands when they have decided the sitting portion of something is finished. He reached across the bell and drew the agreement toward him, turned to the back section with the unhurried certainty of someone who knew exactly how many pages he needed to move through, found the appendix, laid the document flat. Thank you, Franklin. His voice was exactly what it always was, the tone he used in boardrooms and across negotiating tables, clear and without heat, very efficient. He looked down at this page for a moment. I'd like to draw your attention to Schedule C, subsection 4. He turned the document slightly so the relevant section faced across the table. I believe your attorney may have moved past it under time pressure. Franklin's attorney leaned forward first. His eyes found the section, tracked down the 9 lines. James watched the attorney's face. The change was subtle. At first, a slight tightening around the eyes, the particular quality of stillness that descends on a reader when the words in front of them are not doing what the words were supposed to do. The attorney read the section again. Then a third time. He reached for the agreement. Franklin was already taking it from him. He read, "The conference room held its silence, the way a room holds silence when everyone in it has stopped breathing at slightly different moments, and the aggregate has become something close to absolute." Outside the windows, the December morning continued its ordinary business light on glass, the medical mile going about its Saturday, entirely indifferent to what was being understood for the first time inside this room. Franklin kept reading. The room stayed silent. Franklin finished reading. He set the document down on the table with a deliberateness that was different from every other gesture he had made since walking into the room. Not the controlled ease of a man in command, but the careful placement of someone buying himself 3 seconds to think. His attorney spoke first. "This is a data custodianship transfer clause." His voice had the flat, drained quality of a man who has just located the exact point where a calculation went wrong and is still processing the distance between where he thought he was and where he actually is. "It is," James said. He remained seated. His voice carried none of the heat the room might have expected. No satisfaction, no edge, nothing that could be characterized as anything other than the straightforward delivery of accurate information. "By executing this agreement, you've accepted legal custodianship of the entire MedSignal patient data infrastructure. 847,000 records. Full federal compliance obligations. Every audit requirement, every reporting mandate, every liability that attaches to holding the private health information of nearly 1 million people, all of it transferred to you at the moment of signature." He looked at Franklin directly. "The trigger was the litigation transfer clause your own team requested we include. The one that was meant to give you access to the data through the court process." A brief pause. "It gave you the responsibility instead." Franklin stood up. The chair moved back against the hardwood with a sound that was too sharp for the room. "This is entrapment." The word landed with the force of someone deploying the last available defense. His attorney was already on his feet, reaching for the document, turning back to the appendix with the concentrated urgency of a man looking for an exit that isn't there. James did not raise his voice, did not shift in his chair. "You came into this building to take data from 847,000 people who trusted the system with their health information," he said. "People in communities that had no other options. People who gave us their information because they had nowhere else to turn." He looked at Franklin steadily. "I gave you the legal responsibility that comes with holding it. That's not a trap. That's a consequence." Franklin reached for the phone in his jacket pocket. The conference room door opened. Agent Sandra Cho came through first. Plain, dark jacket, federal credentials, already in hand, the unhurried certainty of someone who has been waiting for a specific moment and recognizes it, without needing it, announced. Behind her, 3 agents positioned themselves in the room with the practiced calm of people who have done this many times and understand that restraint is more authoritative than force. "Mr. Mercer," Agent Cho's voice was the same as it always was, measured without effect, entirely clear. "Please put the phone down." Franklin looked at her, then at the credentials, then at the agents positioned behind her. He put the phone down. Agent Cho set a folded document on the table. The arrest warrant, its federal heading, visible across the top, and began. "Wire fraud. Conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud. Obstruction of a federal investigation." And added to the package within the past 72 hours, based on evidence gathered and verified, tampering with federal evidence. Franklin's attorney was already speaking, his voice overlapping with Agent Cho's, demanding to see documentation asserting procedural objections, with the reflexive energy of someone performing due diligence on a situation that due diligence cannot alter. Agent Cho produced a second folder from the case she carried. Thick, tabbed. She set it on the table in front of the attorney without a word. He opened it, stopped talking. A second agent spoke briefly and quietly into a radio. Agent Cho glanced toward the door. "Ms. Diane is being processed in the corridor," she said. She did not resist. James nodded once. He looked out through the conference room windows. The Nashville Medical Mile, in the December morning glass and light, and the ordinary forward motion of a Saturday, indifferent to the specific reckoning taking place inside one of its buildings. He had stood at this window hundreds of times over the years. The view had never looked quite like this. Franklin looked at him from across the room. The legal machinery was already in motion around them. The attorney working through the warrant documentation, the agents completing their procedures, the formal architecture of consequence, assembling itself with the impersonal efficiency of a process that does not require anyone's cooperation to proceed. But Franklin looked at him. The recalculation was complete, the composure restored to something functional, and underneath it was the expression of a man who had played a long game and lost it, and was already identifying the next position. "You think this is over?" he said. James held his gaze. "You went after the patients," he said. His voice was quiet, entirely without performance. "People who had no other option. People who gave their information to a system, because they had nowhere else to go." He paused for one beat. "People like my mother." He let that sit. "Yes," he said. "It's over." Franklin had nothing to say to that. Whatever response he had been reaching for did not arrive in time, and then the agent beside him stepped forward, and the moment passed. Diane was brought through the corridor outside the conference room door. A few minutes later, flanked by 2 agents, her wrists secured in front of her. She was wearing the clothes she had put on that morning, the ones she had chosen knowing what the day was going to be. As she passed the open doorway, she slowed, turned her head. She looked at James. James looked back. Neither of them spoke. There are things that arrive at their end, without the right words existing, to place over them, not because language fails, but because the silence is more complete than anything language could provide. What had been built between them, and what had been done to it, and what each of them had chosen. When the choice became unavoidable, all of it was present in that held moment, and none of it required a single word. Then she was past the doorway and the corridor and gone. James stood in the conference room as the room emptied around him. The agents, the attorney, the notary, gathering his equipment with the careful neutrality of someone whose only role had been procedural. Eleanor remained near the window, her hands folded, watching him with the quiet steadiness of someone who has been present through the full length of a difficult thing and understands that the appropriate response to its ending is simply to remain. Outside, the December morning held its light. The conference room stayed quiet for a long time after everyone left. I didn't move right away. I just sat there at the head of the table, hands wrapped around a ceramic mug I'd brought up from my office, the same mug I'd used since well before any of this started. The coffee had gone lukewarm. I drank it anyway. There's a particular kind of silence that only exists after something has finally ended. Not peaceful exactly. More like the moment after a long exhale, when your body doesn't quite know what to do next because it had spent so long bracing for impact. That was the silence in that room. It sat with me like an old friend who understood there was nothing left to say. I pulled out my phone and called Calvin. He picked up on the second ring. "It's done," I said. A pause. Then all of it? All of it. He didn't whoop or cheer. He just said quietly, "Okay." And somehow, that one word carried more weight than any celebration could have. I drove down to Murfreesboro that afternoon. The sky had shifted from the hard, flat gray of morning into something softer, the kind of pale winter light that turns Tennessee roadways into something almost cinematic. I took the long way through the smaller county roads, past the bare fields and the old grain silos and the roadside diners with hand-painted signs. I wasn't in a hurry. For the first time in 11 days, I genuinely wasn't in a hurry. Calvin's shop was still open when I arrived. The bell above the door announced me the same way it had the first time, a small, ordinary sound that now felt strangely significant. He was behind the counter, organizing a tray of circuit boards when I walked in. He looked up, saw me, and set the work down. I placed an envelope on the counter between us. He looked at it without touching it. "James, I don't need—" "Robert believed in this before anyone else did," I said. "He gave this system a real chance when nobody else would. This isn't a payment. It's something that was owed a long time ago." Calvin picked up the envelope. He held it in both hands for a moment, looking down at it. He didn't say anything else, and neither did I. We just stood there in that small shop, tools hanging on pegboard walls, the low hum of a radio playing something country and faint from the back, and let the silence mean what it needed to mean. I was about 40 minutes outside Nashville on the return drive when Agent Cho called. "Thought you'd want to know," she said. "Mercer Health is now under full federal review, And it's broader than we expected. She told me her team had identified a similar pattern across 7 other health technology companies over the past 12 years. All of them small, all of them mission-driven, all of them operating in underserved regions where data was scarce and the people generating it had no idea what it was worth. Mercer's operation wasn't opportunistic. It was systematic. I thanked her and sat with that for the rest of the drive. I pulled off the road just as the sun began its descent behind the ridgeline. From where I stopped, the Appalachian Mountains stretched out to the southeast, long and dark and ancient, the way they always look in the last light of a winter afternoon. Somewhere out past those ridges was Harlan County. Somewhere out there, a hospital with 41 beds was getting ready to go online. I called Patricia. "The system goes live in 60 days, I said when she answered. "I want you there." "I'll be there." A brief pause, then softer. "James, your mother would have been proud." I look at those mountains for a long time. "Yeah," I said finally. "I think she would." I sat with the phone in my lap. After the call ended, the engine still running, the heater pushing warm air across the dashboard. Outside, the last of the light pulled back behind the ridge, like a curtain being drawn. Tomorrow would come with its own weight. Legal proceedings, depositions, months of work still ahead. But right now, on a county road in Tennessee, with the mountains going dark ahead of me, that all felt very far away. I put the truck in gear and headed home. 3 months can change the shape of a room. The main hall at Vanderbilt University Medical Center had been transformed from a place I'd walked through 100 times, without thinking, into something I barely recognized. Rows of chairs, a podium with a small microphone, a screen at the front displaying a live feed from 200 hospitals across 23 states, each one a blinking green dot on a map of rural America. 200 facilities, 200 communities where the nearest specialist was sometimes 3 mountain ranges away. I stood in the back for a few minutes before anyone noticed me. Calvin was in the front row. He wore a charcoal vest I had never seen before, pressed and buttoned, the kind of thing a man puts on when he wants the occasion to know he took it seriously. He was talking to the woman next to him, one of the 7 CEOs I had quietly reached out to over the past 8 weeks. Leaders of small health technology companies who had been systematically targeted the same way MedSignal had, who had spent years wondering if they were simply unlucky. For most of them, today was the first time someone had told them the truth about what had actually happened to their organizations. I watched Calvin lean toward one of them, nodding with the easy confidence of a man who had seen the worst of something and come out the other side still standing. Eleanor was 3 rows back, reading something on her phone with the focused calm that never seemed to leave her. She had fought harder for the legal architecture behind today than anyone in that room would ever fully know. And just off stage, partially visible through the gap in the curtain, stood Dr. Patricia Okafor. She hadn't been announced publicly yet. That was coming. She was looking out at the audience with the expression of someone who had waited a long time for something and still wasn't entirely sure they were allowed to have it. I knew that feeling. I spoke without notes. I talked about my mother first. Her name was Iris. She grew up in rural Tennessee, in a county where the hospital closed when she was 12 years old. She drove 47 miles for every appointment. She died in 1994, not because medicine failed her, but because distance did. That was the real reason I started MedSignal. Not a business plan, not a market gap. A 47-mile drive that never should have been that long. I talked about Robert Webb, a technician who believed in a version 0.3 piece of software back in 1998 when the code barely ran and the pitch deck had 3 slides. He gave MedSignal something that money couldn't buy. In those early years, the belief that it was worth continuing. His son was sitting in the front row. I didn't look at Calvin when I said it. I didn't need to. I talked about a nurse in Harlan County who stayed after a demo in 2005 when every physician in the room had already left. Who asked questions that took me 3 days to fully answer. Who wrote 14 pages that became the backbone of our first federal application, and never once asked for recognition. Then I made 2 announcements. The first was the establishment of the Robert Webb Memorial Fund, a legal defense resource for small health technology companies operating in underserved regions. Because what happened to MedSignal had happened before. It would happen again, and the next organization facing it deserved to have someone in their corner. The second was the appointment of Dr. Patricia Okafor as Chief Medical Officer of MedSignal Technologies, effective immediately. She walked out from the wings to applause that filled the room in a way that surprised even me. She stood at the podium and didn't say much, just thank you, and that she had waited 20 years to see rural medicine get what it deserved. I said one last thing before I stepped away from the microphone. 847,000 people got a system they deserved 18 years ago. That's not a victory, that's a debt paid. Afterward, I found a spot on the front steps of the building. The lobby coffee machine had produced something unremarkable, thin, slightly bitter, served in a paper cup with a plastic lid. I held it with both hands anyway. The winter sun was doing its best over Nashville, throwing pale light across the stone steps and the bare trees lining the walkway. It was the kind of quiet that only exists after a crowd has thinned the particular stillness of a place that held something important and is now settling back into itself. I didn't think about Franklin Mercer. I didn't think about Diane. Those chapters had their own weight, and they would work themselves out through the proper channels over the months ahead. Right now, there was only the coffee and the sky, and the sound of Nashville going about its ordinary Tuesday. I finished the cup, stood up, walked back through the glass doors. They closed behind me with a soft, clean sound, the kind of sound you wouldn't notice on any other day. But today it felt like the period at the end of a very long sentence, one that had started in a rural Tennessee county in 1987, when a 12-year-old girl learned that the hospital nearest to her home had shut its doors. 18 years of work, one signal finally live. I've thought a lot about what this story really comes down to, and I keep landing on the same place. It was never about the contract, or the data, or the legal trap, or any of the machinery that made the ending possible. It was about the people who showed up before there was any reason to. A technician in 1998, a nurse in 2005, a repair shop owner in Murfreesboro who could have just wiped a hard drive and moved on with his day. Most of the time, the things worth protecting don't announce themselves. They just sit there quietly, doing their work, waiting for someone to notice before it's too late. If this story meant something to you, if any part of it stayed with you, I'd ask you to think about one thing. What are you showing up for before there's a reason to? What system? What person? What mission is out there right now that just needs one person to stay in the room a little longer? That's the only question worth asking. And if you want to be here when the next story begins, you know where to find us.